wherever else you might be finding this particular live stream. This is another episode of Fighting the Void, and it is I, Ginger, back once again to bring you another guest who is way cooler, way more interesting, way more knowledgeable than myself. And by that, I am referring to none other than the Princess of the Multiverse herself, which would be Faith K. Moore.
Hi. Yay.
How you doing, Faith?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it is always a pleasure to have you. I think you are. I think you're more or less tied. You're somewhere. You're like neck and neck for the most frequent guest on the show. I think
this is number 3, maybe.
It's at least number 3.
Yeah, I was on your other show also, so that would be 4. But
that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So this might be. Yeah, this might be at the 4th time. So yeah. You're right. You're right in there. You're certainly in like the top 3.
Well, it's an honor. Thank you.
No, I assure you, the pleasure is all ours. And by ours, I would normally be referring to Crystal, but alas, she has come ill, so she might be lurking though in the chat.
Okay.
So for those who are wanting Crystal's input, Crystal, if you're paying attention and you're in the chat, there you go. Ask your questions in a way that will not result in people hearing you hacking and coughing.
Excellent. That's always good.
Yes. And now this is actually a long-delayed follow-up to our discussion on Henry VIII from a few months back.
Yes.
And we spent most of our time then talking about what happened with all of Henry's wives. And, which ones survived, which ones died, which ones were beheaded, and, all those fun things. And, and I see Eric over there in the over there in the chat, so that's good.
Me too. Hi, Eric.
And so why don't we start first off with just a refresher? What happened with Henry's wives? Again, because that's usually the most interesting part that people want to know about. Yeah,
so I would say definitely I am most fascinated with Henry's wives. Henry is a very interesting character. He's cool, and the source of much debate in history land. But I am, of course, I am always fascinated with the women because that's my deal, right? So the little rhyme to remember what happened to Henry's wives is divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, right? So, and divorced is a little bit of a misnomer. I think we talked about this before because actually, technically, his divorces were actually annulments, but the rhyme is still really helpful. So his first wife was Catherine of Aragon, and she was a Spanish princess, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And she originally came to England to marry Henry's brother, Prince Arthur, who was Henry's older brother and was supposed to be king, but he sadly died before he could take the throne. And so then Henry became the heir, and Catherine was sort of in this weird limbo for a long time. And finally, after Henry's dad, Henry VII, died, Henry VIII decided to marry her. They seem to have actually sort of fallen in love, and he chose her. And they were married for a long time, over 20 years, and they had essentially a happy marriage. The only big problem was that she was not able to provide him with a male heir, which is something that was really important to Henry. So she had one living child, a daughter, Mary, who I think we'll come back to. And all of her other children, I think she had 7 pregnancies, 6 or 7, and all of them either she miscarried or died in early infancy. So basically the fact that she wasn't able to provide him with a male heir was part of the reason why he started to think that maybe he needed to not be married to her anymore. And coupled with that, he fell for a sexy lady in waiting named Anne Boleyn, who was, in my opinion, kind of crazy, and chose not to, she sort of played this game where she was going for the crown, and so she refused to be his mistress. and said that she would only sleep with him if they were married. And so he kind of basically tore the whole country apart, not just because of that. There were other reasons. And there was this sort of legitimate issue of like, I don't have an heir. But I think if Anne Boleyn had not come along, Henry was sort of setting up to legitimize his bastard son by another woman named another mistress who did agree to sleep with him. And so he was kind of setting that up. And then Anne Boleyn came along. So that is what set in motion the Reformation, which
the whole English Reformation, which led to the beheading of his chancellors, St. Thomas More, and basically anyone who had the guts to not say yes to what he wanted to do, because that's all More did.
Exactly. I mean, there was basically an oath. You had to sign this oath that said that Henry VIII was the head of the church, not the Pope. And if you didn't do that, then you were in big trouble. And that's kind of what got Thomas More, now St. Thomas More, in trouble. So all of that happened, and Catherine's my favorite wife, because I think she's really brave, and she's the sort of Disney princess wife to me. Like, she's just got all of these kind of hardships thrown on her, and she just keeps saying like, nope, I'm the queen. It would be so easy for her. She was a very deeply religious Catholic woman, and basically they were saying, don't you want to just go be a nun? And I think like she would have loved to be a nun, like that. She kind of lived a very nun-like life anyway, but she was like, nope, God has called me to be the Queen of England. I since 2 years old, I've been slated to be the Queen of England, and I'm your true wife. And so basically but basically their marriage was annulled by Thomas Cranmer, who came in to be the Archbishop of Canterbury after the Reformation took place. And so she maintained that she was always his true wife, but he maintained that their marriage was annulled, and he used the fact that he had been married, that she had previously been married to his brother, as a sort of biblical evidence for the fact that their marriage should be annulled. So never mind the fact that he also slept with Anne Boleyn's sister, and
never mind any of that.
Marry her, but that's fine. So we've got
never mind shenanigans.
Yeah. So, but he's the king, so whatever. And so we've got Catherine of Aragon. She goes off and sort of into obscurity and dies of cancer later on during the marriage of Henry and Anne. So then we've got Anne, who is basically once they sleep together and she also can't give him a male heir, is pretty much doomed. She is basically, a whole bunch of charges are made up about her, including that she slept with basically every single person, including in the world, including her brother. None of this seems to be true. So it was all kind of made up to get rid of her. It isn't clear how much of a hand Henry had in this. Like, there's a big debate because Thomas Cromwell was also involved and seems to sort of be the architect of this. And we don't really know whether he kind of sold this to Henry, whether he sold it and Henry knew he was being sold, but it worked for him, or whether Henry was kind of in on it the whole time. We don't really know, but it led to Anne's execution. Right after this, like days after this, Henry marries again. He marries Jane Seymour, who was a lady in waiting to Anne. So he's into the ladies in waiting. And he marries her, and she in fact does. Okay, so also Anne couldn't give him any boys, but she does produce one daughter, Elizabeth, who we'll come back to also. And then Jane does produce the much longed for heir. She gives birth to a boy named Edward, but unfortunately she dies soon thereafter. It's been sort of long suspected that she dies of what they called like childbed fever, which is basically like an infection from giving birth. But I've actually read that that may not be the case, because she lived for a little bit longer, I guess, than people would have if that was their ailment. But something happened very soon after his birth, and she died. So that was very sad for Henry and sad for Jane's family, because giving birth to the heir would have secured her as his wife forever. Like, even if his eye had roamed to some other lady, he could never have gotten rid of her.
Some other lady in waiting,
Right. Like, he still couldn't have gotten rid of her. So she would have been set for life, assuming that Edward lived, which he did. So that was sad. So then all of a sudden, Cromwell is like, great, now there's no more ladies in waiting. We're gonna have like an actual dynastic marriage, right? Which had been what was going on with Catherine, but since then Henry'd been sort of just marrying random people that he was
really the most attractive lady in waiting available.
Yeah, exactly. So now Cromwell jumps at the chance to find a Protestant princess for him to marry, because Cromwell is very Protestant, and now the Reformation has happened and Henry's the head of the church. And so off Cromwell goes and finds Anne of Cleves. Cleves is part of what is now Germany. And they were part of the, I don't know how to pronounce this, Schmalkaldic League, which is basically a group of Protestant people. Don't quote me on that. Just
I'm good with that pronunciation because I don't know any better.
We can just pretend that's how you say it. Okay. But basically, it was like a group of Protestant muckamucks. And Henry's like, but I don't really want to marry an ugly person. And off his portraitists go to, paint portraits of different ladies. I mean, they painted Anne and her sister. They painted some other random people. And he picks Anne, or Anna, as she would have been in her home country. And so she comes to England. However, she is offensive to him in a variety of ways. One of them is that she is not aware of Henry's sort of weird penchant for dressing up as other people and surprising people. So I
remember you talking about that.
Yeah. So he sort of appears, and remember, now he's kind of old and he has this leg wound and he's a little stinky, and he shows up and kisses her, and she's really freaked out and upset by this. And, because in England, everyone would have been like, oh, that's the king. I'm going to pretend I don't know it's the king, but I'm going to act like he's so awesome.
You're just going to go along with this bit of weirdness.
Yeah. She didn't know, and she didn't really speak any English. And so she totally committed this faux pas initially. And then Henry decided that she was ugly and smelly. And he also kind of decided that maybe she wasn't a virgin. And all of these led him to say that he did not want to be married to her, and they ended up also having an annulment, and she was sort of okay with this and went away, and she became officially his sister, and she got to live in England and have houses and whatever. So she became his official sister. Okay. So that's another divorce. Then we have, almost there, Catherine Howard, who was another beheaded. She was very young. He's very old at this point. She is very young. It's not entirely clear exactly what her age is, I don't think, but like a teenager. And basically she catches his eye again and he marries her. You can't really say no when the king wants to marry you. So she married him. But she has already a sort of checkered past in that there are two men with whom she potentially had some kind of romantic, maybe sexual relationships prior to marrying Henry. And this really sort of sealed her doom, is that she seems to have had another sexual relationship while married to Henry with a man named Thomas Culpeper.
Yeah, that's not going to go well.
No, it's actually treason. So you have to not do that. And so she was beheaded. And then the final wife who survived, meaning that he died before he could find out of some reason to get rid of her, is Catherine Parr. And she is sort of unremarkable. She was the only sort of whiff of scandal that happened with her is that she was a Protestant and was sort of trying to get him to be more Protestant, and that made him angry. But she kind of backed off, and it was fine. So, and she survived him. So, and then, and he died in 1547.
Okay.
And she lived on. So that is my not so brief summary of the wives of Henry VIII.
Well, that's good because it's a good refresher. Because by golly, there were a lot of them, and and usually the only ones you ever hear about is Catherine briefly,
Yeah.
and then Anne Boleyn, and it was like, and she was the hotness, and that's about it. And there were others, but they don't matter.
Right, exactly. Everyone thinks he had 8 wives. He didn't. He had 6. He was Henry VIII, and that he beheaded all of them. He didn't. He beheaded 2 of them.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Yeah, I was definitely under the impression initially that he had killed more than he actually had.
Right.
And so, but of course, and it is fair though that they focus on the first 2 because the first 2 are the ones that have the lasting consequences.
Exactly. Yes.
With Mary and what was it? I'm sorry, we read through that fairly quickly. Was Anne Elizabeth's mother?
Yes. So Anne is Elizabeth's mother. Yeah,
so
Elizabeth.
I mean, those are the 2 that have the most long-lasting, significant consequences.
Exactly.
Frankly, not just for England, but for the continent, arguably, and certainly for America.
Yeah, and I think also
the road.
Right, and I think that conflict between Catherine and Anne and Henry trying to marry Anne is also what caused this enormous religious conflict that is potentially sort of still raging in a different way now, right? So this break with Rome that happened in England.
Oh yeah, I mean that was, and it's an interesting break because it was kind of like, we're like breaking, but not like totally. I mean, we're not with Luther and those other crazies over there, but we're just we just don't really want to listen to you so much.
Exactly.
But everything else we're kind of okay with. We just don't want to listen to you.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is that like Henry was essentially a Catholic. He didn't want to make the kinds of changes that the sort of Protestant faction in his government wanted him to make that were more sort of Lutheran or Calvinist changes. He wanted it to be the same, like the Mass and the relics and the incense and all of the different, and Latin and all of these things.
He just wanted to be in charge of it all.
Yeah, he just wanted to be in charge, and it sounded really good to him to be in charge. And it was kind of, it was sort of sold to him as like, the Pope is like a foreign monarch. Why is this foreign monarch in charge of you? Aren't you the monarch in your country? And he was
it was all played up by his, to his ego. And then of course, you throw in the necessity of, the whole heir and everything that could happen if he dies without one, and so on and so forth. Yeah, all of these different factors. And then I've also heard it said that his coffers were a little on the light side. So it's like, well, if I'm the head of the church, that means all of this property and all of the resources are now mine.
Exactly. Right. So one thing that happened is, so Henry's father, Henry VII, had been incredibly, careful with his money and had really kind of filled the country's coffers. And Henry was this kind of playboy initially when he first took the throne, and he was kind of spending here, there, and everywhere. And and by the time he's marrying Anne, he has a lot less money. And one of the things that he did was he went in there and he dissolved the abbeys. So he would go in, and because now all these religious institutions belong to him. And so he goes in and basically he sends people looking for like abuses. So relics that aren't really relics, nuns and monks sleeping with each other. And there was like some of that going on.
Of course, some of that was going on because people is people.
Yeah, exactly. But like not as much as they said. And they ended up kind of just trashing all of these abbeys and monasteries and all these places or sort of turning them over to people to live in as homes, just as buildings, and turning out these religious people into the
and then he got to charge rents to all of those people. And especially I remember hearing that the monasteries with all of their considerable land resources, I think it was like, I can't remember the percentage, but it was significant. Chunk of the country belonged to all the different monasteries together. And I know a lot of them they allowed like the peasants and everything to live on or work the land free of charge or at a very low cost. And I was like, but that's money that I could be getting the rent and the taxes and, the things, so I can go wage war with the Spaniards because they're probably pissed at me now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so you can see why it would have caused all kinds of tension, and not just in people's sort of beliefs, like what they actually believed about God and who was what we were supposed to be doing about that, but just I mean, the monasteries fed the poor. They had hospitals. There was all of these sort of services that they provided that were then not available. So I think it created all kinds of tension, not just in people's souls, but in people's actual day-to-day lives. That sort of reverberated through the ages. But anyway, so then he dies, and this sort of this issue of are we Catholic or are we Protestant basically is the issue of the rest of the Tudor dynasty.
Yeah, absolutely. And then of course that kind of sets up the conflict between and I'm going to use the conventional terminology, although I take issue with the characterization, shall we say, but the Bloody Mary and the Good Queen Bess.
Yes. Well, actually, before that, see, this is what's so fascinating is because, we all sort of, then we think like, okay, and then there was Bloody Mary, and then there was Elizabeth I, who reigned for millions of years. But actually, the person that's directly succeeded Henry VIII is his son, Edward. Right. And so Edward is Edward VI. And he was 9 years old when his father died. And so
the regent.
Exactly. So actually, what was set up in Henry's will was a sort of council and the council elected what's called a Lord Protector, which is essentially a regent, but this whole council is supposed to be ruling as opposed to like this one guy.
I see.
But the Lord Protector that was selected was Edward Seymour, who is Jane Seymour's brother. So
I was going to say, I seem to recognize that name.
Right. So this is Edward's uncle, right? Because Edward is Jane's son, and this guy, Edward Seymour, is the brother. Now, Edward also had another uncle named Thomas Seymour, and we can go off on this tangent in a minute, but I will not because it's confusing. But Thomas Seymour married Catherine Parr.
Oh.
So, which is totally a tangent we should go down because it's fascinating. But hold on. But first of all, Edward Seymour is the Lord Protector for a while, and then he sort of falls out of favor, and somebody else becomes the Lord Protector. But sadly, at the age of 15, Edward dies. One sort of myth about Edward is that he was a sort of sickly child and that he was always sick, and then he sort of succumbed, but that's actually not true. He was sort of on the way to being a very sort of athletic prince like his father, and he had some sort of, tuberculosis or some kind of like illness that took him out at the age of 15. And that is when we get the 9 Days Queen, Lady Jane Grey. So the deal is, and this is why it's all about sort of Catholic and Protestant. So the deal is Henry VIII in his will said that Edward would be his heir. And if Edward had no children, then Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, would follow. And if she had no children, then Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, would inherit. And if she was gone and had no children, then the Greys would inherit. And the Greys are sort of like cousins of all these other people.
He put a lot of thought into this.
What's that? Well, yes. And the reason he did that is because he didn't want the sort of Stuart faction to take over, which is like Mary, Queen of Scots, and her children. Mary, Queen of Scots is descended from Henry's older sister. The Greys are descended from his younger sister. But he was trying to sort of get rid of the Mary Queen of Scots faction.
Okay.
And so he did this. And the other sort of iffy part about this is that in order to marry all the different people that he married, he had to delegitimize his children. So Mary and Elizabeth were actually considered bastards because the marriages with their wives with the mothers had to be annulled in order for him to marry more people. So saying that they would be a part of the succession was a little bit like, because he couldn't legitimize them. Because if he legitimized them, then his marriage to Jane was not legitimate because he had these other wives, right? And that meant that Edward was the bastard. Okay, so that's
there's an inherent contradiction in all of that, insofar as part of the argument for Henry being able to assign to different heirs in the first place was basically that, well, if Henry and Parliament say so and so's the heir, then so and so is the heir. Period. End of story.
Yeah. Oh. Right, and that's what he was trying to do. And he was
to
be like whoever, right. I'm somehow saying that these people who are not my legitimate children are going to be my heirs. I mean, I think he kind of felt like, well, I have this healthy male child and he's going to grow up and he's going to have children.
Not going to be an issue.
It's right. There's going to be no problem. Of course, that's not what happened. So basically, Edward was very, very Protestant. He had been raised Protestant. He was, not the Henry VIII version. He was the real deal. And so were the Seymours, who, Edward Seymour, that was his Lord Protector. And so now there was a sort of Protestant faction in charge. And Mary, who becomes Mary the First, also Bloody Mary, was very, very Catholic. And so they really didn't want her to inherit. So basically it's easy because you just say like, okay, but Mary and Elizabeth are illegitimate. So since they're illegitimate, we go to the Greys, and the Greys, yay for them, were also very Protestant. And so Jane Grey is basically a young woman. I mean, she seems to have been basically a pawn. And she is crowned queen right after Edward's death. And she is queen for all of 9 days until Mary gets on her horse, gathers an army, and they ride to London. And as soon as everybody in London hears about this, they're like, well, sorry, okay, never mind. And they let her right in, and she doesn't have to fight anybody, and she takes the throne. And of course, Jane Grey has to go to the Tower of London. Mary really doesn't want to kill her. She thinks it's horrible to kill another woman, another potential queen, a royal. But she ends up having to kill her basically in order to marry the guy that she wants to marry. And we can get to that later in the timeline. So Edward, Lady Jane Grey, Mary the First. And then Mary the First reigns for a period of time and dies, and then Elizabeth sort of naturally succeeds from her. So there's no actual conflict in that. So,
which of course, again, is something that a lot of people think that there is.
Right. Well,
no, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah. I mean, the sisters their relationship was, let's say, rocky, right? Like they actually seem to have loved each other, and spent time with each other when they were younger. Mary is significantly older than Elizabeth,
right?
But and then Mary spent time in Elizabeth's household as sort of a punishment from Anne Boleyn. She was sort of like, haha, you have to go and serve my daughter, and be a sort of lady in waiting type person to her. But even so, Mary sort of took that well, and they're actually buried next to each other in Westminster Cathedral.
Really?
In England, Westminster Abbey. In England, you can go and see them lying in effigy right next to each other.
Fascinating. I did not know that.
Tomb. Yeah. But of course, I mean, Mary had Elizabeth imprisoned during her reign. I mean, it was not like they weren't like friends in that way. But I think had this whole issue not been happening, they would have been loving sisters, but they were not able.
Politics.
I know, sad. So so basically what Henry put in his will kind of happened, except that after Elizabeth reigned for 50, 60 years, then it was in fact the descendants of Mary Queen of Scots that took the throne. So that ended the Tudor dynasty. Whoops. But yeah, but by that point, I mean, I think, they'd had a good run. So yeah, but if you want, we can go back to Thomas Seymour and Catherine Parr for a second.
I was just thinking about, let's go talk about Thomas
Seymour. We do want to delve into like, was Mary really bloody and what was that all about? Because I think we have some questions about that. But
right.
So basically, Catherine Parr had been in love with Thomas Seymour, Jane Seymour's brother, before she married Henry. And she had kind of had her eye on him, and he had Thomas Seymour was a bit of a rogue, and he was always sort of trying to get what was best for him. For example, when his brother was the Lord Protector, Thomas sort of tried to finagle his way into the king's good graces by saying like, hey, they're not giving you enough pocket money. I'm going to give you some more money, trying to kind of say like, hey, I'm the favorite uncle, right? And he initially and basically sort of got in big trouble for doing all of that. Sorry, that's my and he was kind of always trying to see what would be good for him. And so before Catherine Parr married Henry, she was a wealthy widow. She had been married before and was now a widow. And so he was kind of like, ooh, a wealthy widow. And he kind of was trying to get with her, and she seems to have legitimately fallen for him. He was this kind of rakish guy. But,
right.
But then she caught Henry's eye, and Henry sends him off somewhere. So he's like, this is not working for me. I'm sending you off on an embassy to somewhere, and goodbye with you. So after Henry dies, Catherine Parr is now available again and very eager to continue her romance with Thomas Seymour. And Thomas Seymour, this is good for him. She's the Dowager Queen. He would like to marry her. But he also has his eye on Elizabeth, as in the future Elizabeth I. And he really hopes that he'll get to actually marry her. And there is a scandal that we know about where Elizabeth was very close with Catherine Parr. Catherine was her stepmother, and Elizabeth had no mother. She was around 2 when Anne Boleyn was killed. So Catherine Parr was very good to her, and they were very close. And Elizabeth came to live with her after. So Thomas and Catherine do get married.
Okay,
and then Elizabeth comes to live with her. Also, Jane Grey is living with them at this point. Before
we're just collecting random
they're all connected. But anyway, so Thomas Seymour potentially, it's not exactly clear, I think, but he sort of comes into Elizabeth's bedchamber while she is sleeping, and he also is caught maybe embracing her, and so there does seem to be some sort of like inappropriate dalliance going on between the future Elizabeth I and this guy Thomas Seymour. Right. And I don't think he didn't rape her, and I don't think they slept together or anything. I think she was the Virgin Queen, and Catherine Parr got pregnant with Thomas Seymour's child because they're married, and gives birth, but she dies in childbirth. And so she survives Henry, but she doesn't live much longer, and she dies. And then Thomas Seymour seems to want to marry Elizabeth, but that doesn't work out for him, and he is eventually beheaded. And
why was he beheaded?
That's a good question. I think basically, like, I'm not sure what actually did him in. Like, he was involved in all of this scandal with Elizabeth, with trying to get in good with Edward, and I can't remember exactly which thing it was that sent him to the block, but he basically
he crossed the wrong person.
Yeah, he was not a good guy. No. I mean, he seems to have been sort of like like a sort of jock kind of character who was always trying to get
ads, man, I tell you.
Yeah, so he was just he was out for himself, really. So
Gotcha.
yeah, so he did not end well, and Catherine Parr ended up dying in childbirth, and I think it's not clear what then happens to their child, which means that we think that the child died in infancy or young childhood, or they're just sort of lost to history. So that is what happened with them. So back to the timeline, we've got we had Edward, we had 9 Days Queen, Lady Jane Grey, then we've got Mary, and so Mary is super, super Catholic,
right?
And because she's the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and she remains true to her mother. She at one point was forced to sign the oath of succession saying that her father was the head of the church, but in her heart, she did not believe this, and immediately was super excited to turn the country back and become a Catholic country again, and get to getting good again with the Pope and everything else. So that was sort of her deal when she took the throne.
Right. So it was a genuine like back and forth for a while there before. Well, I would say it was probably Elizabeth that really put it on the track to where it's like, yeah, it's going to be a not Catholic country.
Right. So yeah, I mean, Elizabeth's thing was kind of like she was going to try to be more tolerant. But she was a Protestant, and everybody was Protestant. And, during Mary's reign, Elizabeth was kind of forced to pretend that she was a Catholic and go to mass and do all of this stuff. But she was imprisoned for a time because she was sort of caught up in, people thought that maybe she was involved in this rebellion called Wyatt's Rebellion that had to do with all this religious turmoil. But it seems like she wasn't involved in that necessarily. But she did go to the Tower for a while, which was very sad for her.
Everybody gets to hang out in the Tower.
Everybody's hanging out. I mean, the funny thing about the Tower is it's also a palace where you go before you're crowned. So like you can be in the Tower of London for good reasons, and there were like apartments for the royalty to like live in. It was actually one of their residences, and that was the tradition, is before your coronation, you would go and spend the night in the nice part of the like. No
matter what, if you go to the Tower of London, though, something is going to happen with your head.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, we do not think of the Tower of London as like a fun place to be, but in fact, like it was not always bad. But she was not in the good part of it during that time. Yeah, and so okay, should we talk about why she's Bloody Mary?
Let's.
Okay, so Mary married the Philip of Spain. And Spain, as we may remember, is the home of the Inquisition, where they were very brutally executing anyone that was not a Catholic. And Mary seems to have fallen in love, like head over heels in love with Philip via his portrait. So it was like, here is a picture of a guy that might want to marry you. And she was kind of like, yeah, like sign me up for that guy.
So Reformation era Tinder. Got it.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, think about like Henry VIII going and like commissioning portraits of like random.
Right, yeah. The same thing. Oh my gosh.
Right, exactly.
Progress my butt. Anyway.
Totally swiped in whatever direction you're supposed to swipe. I don't right. She totally swiped right on Philip. I've never used Tinder. And yeah. So it was like super, super into marrying this guy. He was not super, super into marrying her. I mean, he was into the idea of marrying her for dynastic reasons, but he was not like falling in love with her.
He wasn't a fan.
Yeah. And I mean, poor Mary, she was not particularly, if we're doing this via Tinder, if we're doing this based on people's portraits, like she was not particularly good looking. She also seems to have had a very low voice, and also was very, I think, short-sighted. So she was kind of squinty, and not super attractive. So it's the Tinder version is, we can sort of understand why maybe he was not super into her, but
fair. Okay.
yeah. So this is sort of tangential to the whole Bloody Mary thing, but one sort of interesting thing is Mary the First was basically the first queen regnant of England, meaning a woman reigning in her own right. So
okay. All right.
There was one person sort of in very long before who kind of didn't end well, and she's not really counted. So Mary is the first woman who was queen, like not by virtue of marrying the king. And so there was this problem, which was, what do we do? Because the idea of the day was that the man is the head of the household, and therefore the man is the king, right? Like if she marries a guy and the guy becomes the king, then he is essentially the monarch. And we don't want that because he is from Spain. We don't want England to become a part of Spain. We want England to be its own entity.
I see.
We, the British at the time. I mean,
right.
But they didn't want England to be sort of like annexed into Spain and just become part of Spain. They wanted it to be its own entity.
Right. Not to mention the Cromwell faction also would be like, yeah, that means we're going back to being like we're definitely going back to being Catholic then, and I'm sure they weren't fans of that.
Exactly.
Of course, I think Cromwell was already dead, but
yeah, I was gonna say Cromwell is dead, but that faction, the Protestant faction, is, I mean, they're already like yikes about Mary, but they definitely don't want to suddenly become part of Spain, which is very, very Catholic. And so basically they sort of deal with this by saying like he will be styled king, but he will not be the king. Like it's all very sort of weird and complicated.
He gets to call himself king. He gets to live in the palace, but you don't actually get to do anything.
Right. Yeah. So that happened. But he also is the reason that Mary ended up executing Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, because he was like, I'm not coming there when there is still this person who could potentially raise some sort of
inspire a revolt.
Revolt that would take the throne and become Protestant and whatever, and render my marriage to you completely irrelevant. And I don't even want to marry you anyway. You're ugly. So, So he was like, I'm not. And Mary was like, well, I'm in love with you, so I'm going to do this. And she was very sad because she hadn't initially wanted to execute Jane, but she did. And so Philip comes, and then, they do execute people for being Protestant. And people are very upset by this. And this is where she gets the name Bloody Mary. I mean, there were definitely executions more than there had been, or maybe would have been, and maybe more than there would have been if she had married Philip, because he sort of comes from this whatever culture of doing that.
Right.
So, I think
he comes from Inquisition era Spain, and not just Inquisition era Spain, but I'm going to mess up the pronunciation of the word. When they were taking it back from the Muslim Spain.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, Spain is really big on being Catholics, right? And like you're saying, they're sort of crusading off to get rid of the Moors, who are the Muslims, right? And that's what Catherine of Aragon's mom and dad were all about before. So I mean, that is why she is styled Bloody Mary, because there were these executions of non-Catholic people during her reign, more than, for example, when Elizabeth came and it flipped to being Protestant. She was trying to take a more sort of middle ground, or a sort of like, I'm not going to look and you can be Catholic, whatever. She also did execute people for their religion.
Oh, definitely. That was when priest holes became a thing.
Yes, exactly. I know. I just listened to really super interesting podcast to
Mhm.
me, because I'm nerdy like that about priestholes.
Mhm.
Yeah, so right. I mean, it was not super great for Catholics under Elizabeth.
No.
But another interesting thing to me about Mary, because although the politics are always fascinating, I tend to be less interested in politics and more interested in people's interpersonal relations. Mary had 2 phantom pregnancies with Philip. Basically, what that means is she thought she was pregnant,
Okay.
meaning her period stopped coming,
Okay.
and her abdomen became larger, um, looking like she was pregnant. And then she went into confinement, which at that time was basically like before a wealthy woman was going to give birth, she would be sort of enclosed in this room,
Okay.
where like they would cover the windows in like dark tapestries, and she would basically have to like stay in there, and there could be no men, and it was very hot and stuffy until the birth of her child. And so she did that, but no baby appeared, and her abdomen went back down, and she wasn't pregnant. And this happened twice to her. So she really, really, really wanted a baby.
Okay.
And basically, it's like it's called like a phantom pregnancy or like a hysterical pregnancy. Basically, like she wanted so badly to have a child. This is what they sort of said at the time, and it's kind of what people think now. It's like basically she had so much anxiety about having a child, and she wanted it so badly that her body kind of like freaked out, and it appeared that she was pregnant for a couple.
What a hell of a psychosomatic effect.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, people think that she already had a bunch of like gynecological issues, and was very well, yeah. With that, it was evidence of that. But like before, like when her mother was going through all of this turmoil, back when Henry was trying to get rid of her, she was always kind of sickly, and it's been suggested that her sickliness was gynecologically related, although there's some contention about that. So like she had some kind of issue, and that is how it manifested in this instance. And so, but what that means is that she had no children,
right?
And so, and then she died of natural causes, and Elizabeth was her heir. I mean, she basically had to admit that Elizabeth was her heir, after these pregnancies turned out to be nothing, and there wasn't really anyone else that she could legitimately say.
And then it had to be Elizabeth. I mean, that was based on Henry's will. And
right, exactly. I mean, there wasn't anybody sort of hanging around that could be the right person.
There were no other options, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess that makes sense.
Right.
So, whoops.
Yeah. And as I said, like Elizabeth had kind of been like when Mary like got all the army and rode to London to take the throne. I mean, Elizabeth rode with her and supported her. But then they had this falling out, and so Elizabeth becomes queen, and she's 25, so she's really still very young, and she reigns from 1558, I think, until 1603.
Wow, that's a good long reign.
Yeah,
especially back then. Holy cow!
Yeah, exactly. And she's known as the Virgin Queen because she never got married, and there's like a whole bunch of speculation about why she never got married. People like to sort of psychologize and say, like, what happened with her mom being killed by her husband really sort of turned her off to the idea of marriage. So that's one thing. Another is this concept of being the queen regnant and what that means about the husband. Is that
thank you much. I like my power.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, she never married. She was always sort of telling different like ambassadors that she would entertain the idea of marrying whichever monarch they were representing, and she was always kind of dangling people on strings and not marrying.
It seemed to be what they portrayed in the in the movie where Kate Blanchett played Elizabeth.
Right.
That she chose to be the Virgin Queen so she could constantly kind of play off all these different powers against each other instead of picking one and potentially inviting war with the others.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good sort of bargaining chip for sure. Right. I mean, she I mean, it's one of these things that are a woman in a time when women were not considered to be equal to men.
Right.
You know, what can you use to be powerful? And I think, you know, it's clever, it's smart to use a feminine thing. For
Right.
example, yourself, right, as a marriage,
Yeah.
a
Obviously,
person
yeah.
with marriage. So, you know, she did use that. I mean, she also seems to have been in love with one of her courtiers, Robert Dudley, and they had a sort of a relationship. We don't know if it was like a sexual relationship or not. I mean, people speculate that it was. Some people speculate that it wasn't. She was very, very angry with him when he got married. He married, I think, someone named, I think, I like to say that her name is Lettice, but I've heard it pronounced lettuce. So it's Lettice. So some people like to say Lettuce, and some people like to say Lettice. I think Lettice is
better because for obvious reasons.
Yes, for obvious reasons. So she was very angry with him for marrying someone else. She wanted him to be hers. So she did have romantic feelings, it seemed like.
She was somewhat possessive.
She just chose not to get married, and that's why the Tudor dynasty ended, because she had no heirs. And James he became James the First of England, and was James VI of Scotland, became king after her, and he began the Stuart dynasty.
Right.
So,
and that kicked in the whole Protestant Catholic thing again, because I remember reading that there was worries that that particular King James there was worry that he was going to take the country back to being Catholic, and so on and so forth. And
right, yes, and it all through the ages, right? Like this scenario is playing out forever.
But, yeah, right. But I imagine it was. I still think it was probably Elizabeth that really kicked it more or less permanently in that direction.
Yeah, I think because I think she also kind of set it up so that, I mean, for sure, it was not okay to be openly Catholic during her reign. And, you know, people who were very, very devout and therefore just couldn't kind of pretend or, you know, whatever, they would have, as you said, they would have these priests in their homes so they could hear mass and do all the things that you need to do when you're Catholic. And they would have these priest holes. I learned this, that there are priest holes and priest hides. So they would have priest holes and priest hides in their homes. A priest hide was a room that could fit many priests, and a priest hole was literally like a hole that you would go in, sometimes under like the toilet or somewhere else like that. And so so you couldn't be openly Catholic, but you could sort of pretend that you were Protestant and then keep being Catholic if nobody noticed.
Right.
So I think that kind of calms the waters in the sense that sort of the trajectory of where England was.
Well, it was also interesting. I mean, in all fairness, I think a lot of the Catholics had essentially gone along with everything, because if you were solidly Catholic, you couldn't, in good conscience, sign that oath going back to Henry and say that, oh yeah, he's totally the head of the Church in England. So as far as there was an awful lot of there was an awful lot of that sort of thing, a lot of how to put it, I don't know, for lack of a better term at the moment, a lot of politics involved in even taking the country back to being Catholic, because most of the people had essentially left it behind under pain of death.
Yeah, well, exactly. Because I think, you know, the issue is, are you Catholic because you are told by the monarch that this is what you're supposed to do, and you know, you go to mass and it's in Latin and you don't understand it, but so then it's very easy for someone like that to kind of be like, whatever, we're Protestant now, fine. But then there was another group of people who were very devout and couldn't. I mean, like we were talking about Sir Thomas More, right? People who just couldn't conscience doing that because their faith was real and very strong,
Right.
and they believed that in order to go to heaven, this is what they had to do. So those were the people that would get into trouble because they weren't able to say, because for them, it's like, yeah, I might get beheaded here, but I will get to go to heaven, versus I will convert, except I'm going to hell because I believe that in order to get into heaven, this is what I need to do. So, those people took a stand, and they had to, and they were very brave. And, they were the ones that got into trouble, right?
Yeah, pretty much. And interesting fun fact for the audience, if you don't know, the James Bond movie Skyfall. That Skyfall is actually the name of the Fleming household. Household. What is that? Is that you again?
What? Yeah. Welcome to New York. It's really loud. Sorry.
Oh, fair enough. There was the Skyfall was the name of the Fleming household back in England, and of course Ian Fleming was the creator of James Bond.
Right.
The Fleming family was Catholic, so all of those secret passages and everything that you saw in the movie, that's actually based on the reality, because that family was the Fleming family was in fact hiding priests in the priest holes of Skyfall back in the day.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, okay, I will plug this right now, because if people are watching this, they're interested in the Tudors. The best Tudor podcast that exists, other than this one that's happening right now, is called Talking Tudors. It is hosted by an Australian woman named Natalie Grueniger, and it's called Talking Tudors. And she interviews every other week. She interviews historians about topics of interest to people who are interested in the Tudors. And she had this one episode about priest holes and hides. And that was the whole thing, is that the houses were built so that inside there were all of these sort of twisty, winding passages and secret doors and all these things, so that if the people came calling to check to see if you had any priests, you could really confuse and foil everybody by going down the different passageways and getting to the priest hole or hide. But I guess the people would stand outside and they would sort of check. They would measure like what the dimensions of the outside were versus the inside. They had like all these ways of finding the priests, and they would come in.
Oh, I'm sure there was a lot of mathing involved there.
Yeah, a lot of architecture information that went into that.
Oh, I have no doubt. It probably became quite the fascinating science, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I think people probably got really into it, especially people who were very zealously like, let's get rid of all these priests.
Right. Of course, Thomas Carlyle and everything was a ways off yet, and Diderot, and those guys were a ways off yet.
Yes.
The really zealous ones.
Yeah.
But in any case, I think that actually pretty much brings us up to time here, Faith. So again, thank you very much for coming on, and I hope everybody had a chance to actually learn a lot. And I know I certainly did, because there was all kinds of things in there that I didn't actually know ahead of time.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on here, because nobody else wants to listen to me talk about this. So thanks.
Well, it sounds like, honestly, that you could go on to the next stage of history there. So
that's where it ends. I know nothing past James the First. I can go backwards, actually. We could go backwards to like Richard III and Edward IV. I can go back, but I can't.
Okay, so get back into like the Crusades and everything, and
or like the Wars of the Roses and Princess in the Tower, Richard III, that kind of stuff.
Okay, great. Yeah, actually, we should totally do that.
Great.
Because honestly, it's a fascinating subject, and again, one of the reasons we do these kinds of episodes is, in fact, because it's important to understand. Even though it's not our country's history, it's the history of the country that sort of birthed us. Right. This stuff does have direct bearing on where we came from. After all, if history didn't play out the way that it did, the founding of America probably would have been completely different. And who knows how things would be today, better or worse? Who knows? We can't say, but it is helpful to know how we got to where we are.
Agreed.
And so tune in next time. Actually, on Fighting the Void, we're going to be having on a woman who has actually had an abortion and has come to regret it. So she's agreed to come on and share her story with us. So you'll definitely want to tune in for that. And then we've got Brian Smith from Truth Cigars and the American Way podcast coming on. And at some point in the future, we'll have to have Faith on to talk about.
Yes, I will definitely tune in.
To talk about either Richard III or maybe some other things that are in the works.
There's all kinds of other things that we can.
There are lots of other things that are currently in the works in a creative fashion that may or may not tie into things having to do with the multiverse.
Yes, so multiverse things, and people are like, "What are you talking about? You're crazy."
It's called a tease, people.
Just watch this space is all we're saying.
Exactly. Watch the space. There will be more to come in the future.
Always.
So, again, thanks again, Faith, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in, and keep fighting the good fight until next time.